Psalm chapter 23, Psalm 23. I dare say that I probably use Psalm 23 in more funeral services than probably any other scripture in the Bible, and it's probably been used more in funeral services than most any other chapter in the Bible. This chapter we find comfort and consolation and peace and strength and God's grace so strong in Psalm chapter 23. But not only have I found it during those type of services, but I've also found this chapter to help me in my own personal individual life when it feels like that that everything is going wrong and everything's going bad and I just feel hopeless and helpless. I can turn to these words and they really do help me as well. Psalm 23, many folks has different thoughts on when they think that Psalm 23 was written. There's some folks that will tell you that Psalm 23 was probably written when David got victory over the lion that was getting a hold of one of his father's sheep. And it could have been, but I don't think so myself. Others will say it was when the bear came in and the bear started getting a hold of one of his father's sheep and he destroyed that bear. And that's when he wrote Psalm 23. I personally don't think so either. During that case, there's some that will say, well, it was probably sometime during the time that he committed that sin with Bathsheba. I personally don't believe that's when he wrote Psalm 23 either. But I believe that David wrote Psalm chapter number 23 during the time when he was fleeing in exile from his very own son, Absalom. If you'll read the scripture, we see that David committed sin with Bathsheba. And God forgave David of his sin because David had a repentant heart. And we have the prayer of David, according to scholars and theologians, recorded in Psalm 51, where he asks the Lord to restore unto him the joy of thy salvation. And so David repented of that sin. But yet the Lord looked at David and he said, even though that you have repented of the sin and you have been forgiven, yet the sword of the Lord shall never depart from thine house. So we see Amnon and Tamar, brother and sister, incest and rape is committed here as Amnon desired his own sister. The Bible said after he called for her and he had her come down and he raped his own sister, committed incest. And after he had done this deed, the hate that he had for her was greater than the love that he ever had for her. So chaos is going on. Catastrophic events is occurring. Well, Absalom, David's son, he didn't like what his brother had done to his sister, what Amnon had done to Tamar. So he seeks revenge on Amnon and takes his life, his brother's life. When folks says that what I do doesn't affect nobody but me, that is so wrong. I mean, what we do not only affects us, it affects others that we love around us. It affects our home and our family and our loved ones. So we see that Absalom, he does this deed. Then he flees into exile for a few years, 2 or 3 years maybe. And he builds up a great army. And there's one thing that he desires above everything else. He's rebelling against his own father David. He's desiring the throne of David, his father. He's wanting that kingdom. So he gets this army together and he rebels against his own father and goes after his own father. And now David is fleeing from his own son, Absalom. Absalom was a very handsome man, took great pride in his long, beautiful hair. And so we see that Absalom pursues after his father. His father's in exile now. Things has changed. Meanwhile, Absalom's back at the throne of David. He's rolling over the kingdom. And David's in exile, fleeing from his own son, in a poor and a pitiful condition. in a bad atmosphere. But there's some folks like Barzillai who looks at David, and David's not a young man now. He's probably about 65 years old during this time. He's not that young shepherd boy that could jump from one hillside to the other hillside and move around like the deer and the hart and all of that. He's 65 years old now. But there's a man named Barzillai that looks at David, and David said, you might as well go and allow my son Absalom to be your king. He said, not so. David, you're my king. You're the only king that I have. I'm glad in this modernistic world that there's folks that will not bow down to any other God, any other deity, except for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Bible. So I believe this is when David begins to pin down Psalm chapter 23. He's committed the sin with Bathsheba. He's lost the son that they had during that relationship. He's asked God to forgive him. The sword of the Lord is still at his house. Amnon and Tamar, his son and daughter, incest and rape has been committed. Absalom has took the life of his own brother Amnon. Absalom has fled into exile, built up an army, came against his father. Now David's in exile while Absalom is ruling on David, his father's throne, and over his kingdom, and all of that. David is devastated. David is in a terrible atmosphere, in a poor and a pitiful condition. And I believe that's when he penned down these words and said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Definite article, not a Lord, but the Lord. The Lord is, not past tense, not future tense, but present tense. The Lord is my personal pronoun. He belongs to me, and I belong to him. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness, for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I believe that was coming from a broken-hearted psalmist. In exile, hungry, thirsty. But he had a few folks there that really cared about his condition. Now for the rest of the story. Joab, David's captain of his army, comes to David and says, I think we got an army big enough to take care of Absalom's army. David said, that's great, but I got one request. Don't do no harm to my son. Whatever you do, do no harm to my son. After all that Absalom had done to David, David did not want him to do any harm to his son. So Absalom gets David's army together. They start pursuing after the enemies of David, which at this time was his son and the army that he had. It just so happens that as they're journeying that Absalom's out there as well. And Joab sees he's a perfect opportunity and he takes advantage of it and he pursues after David's son Absalom. You remember that beautiful long hair that I told you about that Absalom took great pride in? All of a sudden the boughs of a big old oak tree captures that long beautiful hair and he's hanging there helplessly, defenselessly. Nobody there to help him. Hanging there by the hair of his head. David said, do my son no harm. But this is the very one who has killed his brother. David said, do my son no harm. But this is the very one who has took the throne in the kingdom of David. Yet David said, do him no harm. But Joab, he had 3 darts, and he pierced him right in the heart. Came back, and David could look and tell that something had happened. He knew that his son had died in the battle. He said, oh, my son Absalom, oh, my son Absalom, oh, that I could have died for thee. Some of the saddest words probably recorded in the scriptures. Psalm 23 talks about the valley of the shadow of death. In order to have a valley, you got to have 2 mountains. You got to have a mountain peak here and a mountain peak here. That's what makes a valley, is 2 mountain peaks. So the valley of the shadow of death is recorded in Psalm 23. But in Psalm 22, we have Mount Calvary. Words that Jesus would say on the cross at Mount Calvary. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Right there in verse number 1 of Psalm 22. So that is one mountain peak. That's Mount Calvary in Psalm 22. Scriptures on down through here in Psalm 22 that we don't have time to get into depicts Mount Calvary. Psalm 23 is a valley, so we got a mountain peak here called Mount Calvary. We got a valley, but we need another mountain peak to make that a valley. So in Psalm 24, the question is asked, who shall ascend unto the hill of God? Who shall ascend unto the hill of God? Mount Zion, the hill of God. Mount Zion. Because of Mount Calvary, we have the promise, the hope, and the assurance of Mount Zion. If it had not been for Mount Calvary, there would be no Mount Zion. I'm thankful for the suffering of Mount Calvary so that we can have the promise of the joy of Mount Zion. But remember, there's a valley that connects these 2 mountain peaks. Psalm 22, Mount Calvary, and Psalm 24, Mount Zion. And right in the middle in Psalm 23 is that low valley called the shadow of death. Thank God, Mount Calvary provided salvation. And Mount Zion is going to be a place where we'll get to enjoy the fruit and the labor of our salvation. Psalm 22 is a portrait of Mount Calvary. Psalm 24 is a portrait of Mount Zion. Because of Mount Calvary, we have the hope and the assurance and the consolation of Mount Zion. But we must go through that valley of the shadow of death. But David said, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Ain't that amazing? So God is with us. Mount Zion, Mount Zion, Mount Calvary, and then we got the valley of the shadow of death right there in the midst of these 2. I'm not saved by what Jesus is going to do in the future. I'm saved by what he's already done on the cross at Calvary. So Psalm 23 brings so much comfort to our hearts. It was written during a time when David was in a valley. But because of Mount Calvary, he wasn't going to stay in that valley. And because of Mount Calvary, we don't have to stay in the valley either. One day, we're going to make it to Mount Zion, and we're going to enjoy the blessings of God forevermore. Thank y'all for watching this little devotional. I appreciate everyone on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Please follow us, subscribe to our channel, whatever you do on the social media platform that we're on, please do that. I hope this has been a blessing to you. May God richly bless you. Until the next time.